The morning Papa announced my engagement to Jeremiah Barfield, I was churning butter in the kitchen, my arms already aching from the endless circular motion. The cream had been stubborn that day, refusing to separate, much like my thoughts which scattered and reformed with each turn of the paddle. Papa stood in the doorway, his sheriff's badge catching the early light that filtered through our single window, and spoke the words that would change everything as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. "You'll marry Jeremiah come October," he said, not bothering to remove his hat or acknowledge the way my hands stilled on the churn handle. "It's settled." I stared at the wooden paddle suspended in the half-formed butter, my knuckles white against the smooth handle I'd gripped since before dawn. Jeremiah Barfield. The man was near 40, with hands that lingered too long when he thought no one was watching and eyes that catalogued women like livestock at auction. I'd seen him handle his horses with the same calculating appraisal he gave me whenever he visited our house for Papa's poker games and unofficial business dealings. "I ain't marrying anyone come October," I said quietly, resuming my churning with deliberate strokes. The rhythm helped steady my voice, kept it from betraying the storm building in my chest. Papa's laugh was harsh, the sound he made when he caught someone in a lie or witnessed what he called weakness. "You'll do as you're told, Margaret Rose. Jeremiah's got money and land, and he's agreed to take you despite your difficulties." My difficulties. That's what Papa called my stubborn streak, my tendency to speak when spoken to rather than simply nod and agree, my habit of reading every book that came through town whether it was deemed appropriate for young ladies or not. In Papa's estimation, these traits made me damaged goods, harder to marry off than a prize heifer, with a limp. "Besides," Papa continued, settling into his chair at the kitchen table and expecting his breakfast to appear without him having to ask, "Jeremiah's been patient long enough. Man deserves a wife, and you're old enough to fulfill your duties." The way he said duties made my skin crawl. I'd turned 19 just last month, which Papa considered practically ancient for an unmarried woman, though I'd noticed he'd had no trouble keeping me around to cook his meals, mend his clothes, and manage the household while he spent his days terrorizing the good people of Wigby with his badge and his bad temper. I cracked eggs into the skillet with perhaps more force than necessary, watching the whites spread and bubble in the hot lard. Papa had been sheriff of Wigby for near 15 years, ever since he'd married my mother and inherited the position from her father. The townspeople tolerated him because they had no choice, but I'd heard the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered Miller's General Store or passed groups of women on the church steps. Sheriff Virgil Harrington ruled through fear and favoritism, collecting what he called taxes, but what everyone knew were bribes, turning blind eyes to certain infractions while coming down hard on others who couldn't pay for his lenience. The honest folks kept their heads down and their mouths shut, while men like Jeremiah Barfield flourished under Papa's protection, growing fat on schemes that would have landed lesser men in jail or run out of town. "I'll need you to start learning Jeremiah's household preferences," Papa said around a mouthful of eggs and biscuit. His late wife kept things a particular way, and he expects the same standards. Late wife. Mary Barfield had died just 2 years past, though the circumstances remained mysteriously vague. Some said consumption, others whispered about accidents and unexplained bruises, but no one spoke openly about what everyone suspected. Women didn't last long in Jeremiah Barfield's house, and the few servants who'd worked there never stayed more than a few months before finding employment elsewhere or leaving town entirely. I served Papa his breakfast in silence, my mind working through possibilities like fingers sorting through a basket of buttons, categorizing each option by size and usefulness. Running away would only bring me back within days, probably in worse condition than when I left. Papa had too many connections, too many people who owed him favors or feared his retribution. Direct confrontation would only result in punishment and an earlier wedding date. But there had to be another way, something Papa hadn't considered because he'd never bothered to truly see me or understand what I was capable of. After Papa left for his morning rounds, I finished my kitchen duties and walked to town, ostensibly to purchase fabric for what he assumed would be my wedding dress. The October air carried hints of the coming winter, and I pulled my shawl tight against the wind that swept down from the mountains and through the valley, where Wigby had grown up around the crossroads of two cattle trails and the hopes of people seeking something better than what they'd left behind. Miller's General Store occupied the corner of Main and Church Streets, its windows displaying bolts of cloth, household goods, and the occasional luxury item that arrived on the monthly supply wagon from Denver. Mrs. Miller looked up from her account books when I entered, her expression carefully neutral. Like everyone else in town, she knew better than to show too much friendliness toward Sheriff Harrington's daughter, though I'd always sensed she harbored some sympathy for my situation. "Morning, Margaret Rose," she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth reserved for those she considered genuinely decent despite their unfortunate circumstances. "What can I help you find today?" "I need fabric," I said, running my fingers along a bolt of blue cotton that felt soft and practical beneath my touch. "Something suitable for special occasions." Mrs. Miller nodded knowingly, though her eyes held a sadness that told me she'd heard about my engagement through the gossip networks that kept small towns functioning. Information traveled faster than horses in Wigby, and Papa's announcement would have made its rounds before he'd finished his second cup of coffee. "This blue would suit your coloring," she offered, though her tone suggested she was going through the motions rather than celebrating my supposed good fortune. "Or perhaps something in green. I've got a lovely piece that came in last week." While Mrs. Miller pulled down bolts of fabric for my inspection, I let my gaze wander around the store, taking inventory of everything available, cataloging supplies and possibilities with the same thoroughness Papa applied to his unofficial business dealings. My eyes lingered on the section where Mrs. Miller kept the letter-writing supplies, good paper, ink, sealing wax, and pens that could produce clear, official-looking script when handled by someone with proper penmanship. "Mrs. Miller," I said carefully, "I don't suppose you'd have any books about legal matters? Property laws, maybe, or territorial regulations?" She looked surprised by the request, then thoughtful. "Can't say I carry such things regular-like, but I might could order something specific if you're looking for particular information." "What sort of legal matters?" "Oh, just women's property rights, inheritance laws, that sort of thing," I said as casually as possible while examining a bolt of yellow cotton with excessive interest. "Mama left me some things, and I want to make sure I understand my rights proper-like." This wasn't entirely a lie. Mama had indeed left me a few personal items when she died of fever 3 years past, though Papa had made it clear he considered himself the sole inheritor of anything valuable. But Mrs. Miller didn't need to know the specifics of what I had in mind. "I could write to my supplier in Denver," she offered. "Might take a few weeks, but I reckon he could locate something useful. Legal books ain't common out here, but there's probably lawyers who keep such things for reference." I thanked her and selected enough blue fabric to make a dress, paying with coins I'd saved from the household money Papa allotted for groceries and necessities. He never bothered to check my accounting too closely, assuming I lacked either the intelligence or the nerve to cheat him, which had allowed me to accumulate a small reserve over the past 2 years. From Miller's store, I walked to the post office, which occupied a corner of the territorial courthouse where Papa maintained his official office and the jail cells that housed his prisoners. The building smelled of tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the particular staleness that accumulated in places where justice was dispensed according to personal whim rather than written law. Mr. Cornelius Finch served as both postmaster and clerk of court, a thin, nervous man who'd held both positions since territorial days and who possessed the invaluable ability to remain invisible when powerful men conducted questionable business. He looked up from his sorting when I approached his window, his expression immediately shifting to the wary politeness he showed anyone connected to the sheriff's family. "Miss Harrington," he said, straightening a stack of letters that didn't need straightening. "What brings you by today?" "I'd like to send some letters," I said, producing paper and ink from my small purse. "And I'm wondering about territorial laws regarding marriage contracts and property transfers." Mr. Finch's eyebrows rose slightly, but his years of discretion had taught him not to ask unnecessary questions. "What sort of information are you looking for?" "Just curious about the legal requirements," I said, settling at the small writing desk he provided for customers. "Like, what makes a marriage contract valid? What kind of documentation is required? That sort of thing." He disappeared into the back room and returned with a thick leather-bound book that looked official and well-used. Territorial statutes, he explained, setting it carefully on the counter. You're welcome to look through it, though it ain't easy reading. I spent the next hour copying relevant sections into my own notebook, paying particular attention to the requirements for valid marriages, the legal age of consent, and the procedures for filing complaints against public officials. Mr. Finch pretended to busy himself with other tasks while keeping a discreet eye on my activities, though he made no move to stop me or ask questions about my sudden interest in territorial law. The marriage statutes proved particularly enlightening. According to territorial law, both parties had to consent freely to the union, without coercion or duress. Any marriage performed under threat or against the will of either party could be declared invalid by a territorial judge. More interesting still, sheriffs who abused their authority or violated territorial regulations could be removed from office and face criminal charges, particularly if their actions involved corruption, extortion, or violation of citizens' rights. I copied the relevant sections word for word, along with the names and addresses of territorial officials in Denver who handled complaints against local law enforcement. The wheels of justice might turn slowly in frontier territories, but they did turn, especially when provided with proper documentation and compelling evidence. After finishing my research, I wrote 3 letters with careful attention to penmanship and formal language. The first went to the Territorial Governor's Office in Denver, requesting information about procedures for filing complaints against local officials. The second went to the Territorial Attorney General, asking about marriage laws and the protection of women's rights under territorial statutes. The third went to a law firm in Denver that Mrs. Miller had mentioned, requesting consultation about inheritance rights and property law. I sealed each letter with wax and paid the postage from my small reserve of saved coins, knowing Papa would never think to check on my correspondence. In his mind, I lacked both the education and the initiative to conduct any business more complicated than grocery shopping, which would prove to be his first significant miscalculation. Walking home, I felt something shifting inside me, like tumblers falling into place in a lock that had been stuck too long. Papa had spent years underestimating me, treating me like property to be disposed of at his convenience, never bothering to notice that I'd been watching, learning, and preparing for the day when his carelessness would finally work against him. That evening, Jeremiah Barfield came for dinner, as he had every Thursday for the past month. He arrived precisely at 6, dressed in his best suit and carrying a bottle of whiskey for Papa and a small bouquet of wildflowers that were already wilting from his rough handling. I watched from the kitchen as he settled into what he clearly considered his rightful place at our table, spreading himself across the chair like he was already master of the house. "Margaret Rose looks lovely tonight," he told Papa, his eyes lingering on me in a way that made my skin crawl. "October can't come soon enough." Papa laughed and poured generous measures of whiskey for both men. "She's learning to be more agreeable. Ain't you, girl?" I served dinner without speaking, keeping my expression neutral while my mind catalogued every word, every gesture, every casual assumption about my cooperation in their plans. Jeremiah's hands were soft for a man who claimed to work his own land, and I noticed the expensive fabric of his suit, the gold watch chain across his vest, the rings that caught the lamplight when he gestured. "Course, she'll need some guidance at first," Jeremiah said, cutting his beef with particular attention to precision. My late wife had some difficulty adjusting to my expectations, but she learned well enough eventually. The way he said eventually made Papa nod approvingly, as if he understood perfectly what sort of guidance Jeremiah had in mind. I refilled their glasses and retreated to the kitchen, where I could hear their conversation without having to endure their calculating stares. They discussed my future as if I were a business transaction, what household skills I possessed, what improvements might be needed, how my inheritance from Mama might be transferred to Jeremiah's control after the wedding. Papa mentioned the small plot of land Mama had owned before their marriage, property that legally belonged to me, but which he'd been managing since her death. "That'll make a nice addition to the north pasture," Jeremiah said. "Good water rights, if I remember correct. The deed's in her name, but that ain't no problem," Papa replied. "Soon as you're married, it'll be yours to manage proper like." I stood in the kitchen doorway, my hands steady on the coffee pot I was preparing, and listened to them divide up my life and my property like they were splitting the bill for dinner. Neither man bothered to lower his voice or consider that I might have opinions about their arrangements, which would prove to be their second significant miscalculation. After Jeremiah left, Papa settled into his evening routine of whiskey and complaint, cataloging the day's irritations and the various ways the people of Wigby had failed to show proper respect for his authority. I cleaned the dishes and listened to him ramble about ungrateful citizens, territorial bureaucrats who didn't understand frontier realities, and the burden of maintaining law and order among people too stupid to appreciate his efforts. "You're lucky Jeremiah's willing to take you on," he said, his words slightly slurred from the whiskey. "Most men wouldn't want a wife with your independent notions." I dried the last plate and hung the dish towel on its hook, my movements precise and unhurried. "Yes, Papa. Once you're married, you'll learn to keep your opinions to yourself," he continued. "Jeremiah knows how to handle difficult women. His first wife was headstrong too, but she settled down right quick." Settled down. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, carrying implications that made my stomach turn. I'd seen Mary Barfield in town during her brief marriage, watched her flinch when Jeremiah touched her arm, noticed how she'd grown thin and quiet in the months before her death. "I understand, Papa," I said, and for the first time in my life, the words felt completely true. I did understand, not just what he expected of me, but what he'd underestimated about me, and how I was going to use that blindness against him. Late that night, after Papa had stumbled off to bed, I sat at the kitchen table by lamplight and began planning in earnest. I pulled out the notes I'd copied from the territorial statutes and spread them across the table like a map of possibilities. Each law, each regulation, each procedural requirement represented a potential weapon in what was shaping up to be a very different kind of war than Papa had anticipated. The autumn wind rattled our windows and sent leaves skittering across the porch, but inside our kitchen, I felt perfectly calm for the first time in weeks. Papa and Jeremiah had made their plans without consulting me, assuming I'd submit to their arrangements like a well-trained horse accepts a bridle. They'd forgotten that horses sometimes bolt, sometimes throw their riders, and occasionally prove far more intelligent than their handlers ever suspected. I had 6 weeks until October, 6 weeks to gather evidence, establish correspondence with territorial authorities, and prepare a response that would be both devastating and completely legal. Papa had taught me to be thorough in everything I did, to pay attention to details, and to think several moves ahead when dealing with opponents. He just never considered that someday he might be the opponent. The first response to my letters arrived 3 weeks later, carried by the regular mail courier who brought correspondence from Denver twice monthly. Mr. Finch handed me the envelope with careful neutrality, though I caught the flicker of curiosity in his eyes when he noticed the official territorial seal embossed in the corner. I thanked him calmly and tucked the letter into my marketing basket alongside my other purchases, waiting until I reached home to break the seal in the privacy of my own room. The Territorial Attorney General's office had sent a formal response outlining marriage laws and women's rights under territorial statutes, along with procedures for filing complaints about forced marriages and official misconduct. More importantly, they'd included forms for reporting violations of territorial law and the address of a territorial judge who specialized in cases involving abuse of authority by local officials. I read through everything twice, making careful notes in my private journal, which I kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard under my bed. The laws were clearer than I'd hoped and more comprehensive than Papa likely realized. Territorial authorities took a dim view of sheriffs who abused their positions, particularly when it came to violating citizens' basic rights or engaging in corruption schemes. The second letter arrived a week later, this time from the law firm in Denver. They were willing to provide consultation on inheritance and property matters, though they'd need detailed information about my specific situation before offering concrete advice. They'd also included a list of documents that would be helpful: property deeds, marriage certificates, death certificates, and any written agreements or contracts related to property transfers. This presented my first real challenge, since Papa kept all important documents locked in his desk at the sheriff's office. But I'd been cleaning that office twice weekly for the past 2 years, ever since he'd decided the territorial government wasn't paying enough for a proper cleaning woman. He'd never bothered to change his hiding places or vary his routines in my presence, assuming I was too simple to understand the significance of what I saw. The opportunity came on a Thursday morning when Papa rode out to investigate reports of cattle rustling on the Jameson Ranch, a matter that would keep him occupied most of the day. I arrived at his office with my cleaning supplies and bucket, nodding to Deputy Walsh, who was dozing in his chair by the front window. "Just here to clean, Mr. Walsh," I said quietly, not wanting to wake him fully. Deputy Walsh was a decent man trapped in an impossible position, forced to carry out Papa's orders or face unemployment in a territory where jobs were scarce and references from previous employers essential. He mumbled something about being careful not to disturb his paperwork and settled back into his nap. Papa's desk occupied the far corner of the office, positioned so he could watch both the street and the jail cells while conducting business. The locked drawer where he kept important documents was secured with a simple lock that I'd watched him open hundreds of times. More usefully, I discovered that the lock mechanism was old and poorly maintained, prone to sticking in ways that had taught Papa to jiggle the key, just so, while applying pressure to the drawer front. I'd practiced the motion with a bent hairpin during previous cleaning sessions, working the mechanism while Papa was distracted with other tasks. Today, with only Deputy Walsh's snores for company, I had the drawer open within minutes. Inside, I found exactly what I'd hoped for: property deeds, including the deed to Mama's land that Papa claimed to manage on my behalf, marriage certificates, business contracts, and a leather portfolio that contained what appeared to be Papa's personal financial records. I worked quickly but carefully, copying the relevant information into my cleaning rag, which I prepared with invisible pockets sewn into the lining for exactly this purpose. Mama's property deed proved particularly interesting. According to the legal description, she'd owned not just the small plot Papa had mentioned to Jeremiah, but a considerably larger section that included water rights and mineral claims. More importantly, the deed clearly stated that the property was to pass to her heirs and assigns, which meant me, upon her death. Papa had been collecting rent from farmers who leased portions of the land, income that legally belonged to me. I also discovered copies of agreements between Papa and various businessmen in town, arrangements that detailed payment schedules for what were obviously protection services rather than legitimate law enforcement. Jeremiah Barfield's name appeared frequently, along with specific amounts and dates that corresponded to times when Papa had ignored complaints about Jeremiah's treatment of his workers or his questionable business practices. Most damaging of all, I found a series of letters between Papa and a territorial land commissioner discussing the transfer of various properties to Papa's associates at prices well below market value. The correspondence made it clear that Papa was using his position to intimidate property owners into selling cheap, then splitting the profits with buyers like Jeremiah who knew exactly what they were purchasing and how it had been acquired. I copied everything I could in the time available, my hand cramping from the speed required to transcribe documents while keeping watch for Papa's return. Deputy Walsh continued to snore peacefully, occasionally stirring to adjust his position but never fully awakening. By the time I finished cleaning the office and locked Papa's drawer again, I had enough evidence to support multiple charges of corruption, abuse of authority, and violation of territorial statutes. The third letter from Denver arrived just as October began painting the aspen trees gold against the mountainsides. This one came from the territorial governor's office and contained information about filing formal complaints against local officials, along with the name of an investigator who specialized in cases involving corrupt sheriffs and territorial law violations. More importantly, it included a section about emergency protective orders for women facing forced marriages or domestic threats. According to territorial law, any woman could request protection from a territorial judge if she could demonstrate that local authorities were either unwilling or unable to protect her rights. The process required sworn testimony and supporting evidence, but it could result in immediate intervention by territorial marshals and suspension of local officials pending investigation. I spent that evening crafting my formal complaint, using the legal language I'd copied from territorial statutes and organizing my evidence according to the guidelines provided by the Attorney General's office. The document detailed Papa's corrupt practices, his plan to force my marriage to Jeremiah Barfield, and the evidence I'd gathered showing systematic abuse of his authority as sheriff. Writing everything down in legal terminology made the full scope of Papa's crimes clear even to me. He hadn't just been taking bribes or bending rules for friends. He'd been running an organized criminal enterprise under cover of his badge, using fear and intimidation to extort money from honest citizens while protecting men like Jeremiah, who paid for the privilege of operating outside the law. The next morning, I took my completed complaint to the post office, along with copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. Mr. Finch looked surprised by the thickness of the envelope and the official address, but he accepted my postage payment without comment. As I watched him place my letter in the outgoing mail bag, I felt a mixture of excitement and terror that reminded me of standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing I was about to jump but uncertain where I'd land. "Expecting important news?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes curious. "Just some legal matters that need attention," I replied, matching his casual tone while my heart hammered against my ribs. "Family business." He nodded knowingly, though I suspected his interpretation of family business differed considerably from the reality of what I'd just set in motion. In small towns, family business usually meant inheritance disputes or property boundaries, not formal complaints to territorial authorities about criminal corruption and forced marriage. That afternoon, Jeremiah arrived for another of his regular visits, this time bringing fabric samples and discussing wedding plans with Papa as if my participation were purely ceremonial. They'd settled on a date, October 24th, and arranged for the ceremony to be performed by a circuit judge who owed Papa several favors and could be counted on not to ask inconvenient questions about my consent. "Margaret Rose seems quieter lately," Jeremiah observed, studying me with a calculating expression he usually reserved for livestock purchases. "More cooperative." Papa laughed and refilled both their glasses. "Told you she'd come around. Just needed time to understand the benefits of the arrangement." I served their dinner in silence, listening to them discuss my future disposition like horse traders settling on a price. According to their plans, we'd be married in the courthouse with minimal ceremony, followed by a brief reception at Jeremiah's house for his business associates and Papa's political allies. I would then take up residence at Jeremiah's property, where he expected me to manage his household while he focused on expanding his various enterprises. "Course, there'll be some adjustments at first," Jeremiah said, cutting his meat with particular precision. "But I find most difficulties can be resolved with proper guidance and consistency." The word consistency carried the same threatening undertone as eventually had during their previous conversations, and I noticed Papa nodding approvingly as if he understood exactly what sort of guidance Jeremiah had in mind. They discussed my domestic training, my reading habits, which Papa considered excessive and potentially problematic, and the need to establish clear expectations from the beginning of our marriage. "Can't have a wife thinking she knows better than her husband," Papa said, gesturing with his fork for emphasis. "That's what went wrong with my Mary, too much book learning, too many opinions. Margaret Rose has the same tendency, but she's young enough to learn better." They talked about Mama as if she'd been a particularly stubborn horse that had required breaking, rather than a woman who died caring for others during a fever epidemic while Papa had spent his time in the saloon avoiding the sick room. Mama had been educated, capable, and kind, qualities that Papa had apparently considered character flaws rather than virtues. After Jeremiah left, Papa settled into his evening routine of whiskey and self-congratulation, reviewing the day's successful intimidations and profitable arrangements. He seemed particularly pleased with himself that night, counting money from various sources and making notes in a ledger that I suspected contained records of his unofficial income. 3 more weeks, he said, looking up from his calculations with satisfaction. Then you'll be Jeremiah's problem instead of mine. I finished cleaning the kitchen and prepared his nighttime whiskey, adding just enough water to weaken it slightly without him noticing. Over the past month, I'd been gradually diluting his evening drinks, not enough to sober him completely, but sufficient to ensure he slept more soundly and woke with clearer recollections of our conversations. "Papa," I said carefully, setting his glass within easy reach, "what happens to Mama's property after I marry Jeremiah?" He looked surprised by the question, then pleased that I was finally showing interest in practical matters. Becomes his to manage, naturally. I can't have a woman trying to handle business affairs. Look how that turned out for your mother. But the deed is in my name. I pressed gently. Don't I have some say in how it's used? Papa laughed, the sound containing genuine amusement rather than his usual harsh mockery. Margaret Rose, you don't understand how these things work. Once you're married, everything you own belongs to your husband. That's the law, and it's the natural order. Women ain't equipped for property management or business decisions. I nodded as if this explanation satisfied me, while mentally adding his words to the growing list of statements that would support my case with territorial authorities. Papa's assumption that I understood neither law nor business would prove particularly useful when investigators began examining his activities and my evidence. Jeremiah's got plans for that land, Papa continued, warming to his subject. Knows how to make it productive instead of just sitting there growing weeds. You'll benefit from having a husband who understands investment and development. What Papa meant was that Jeremiah intended to strip the timber, lease the grazing rights to the highest bidder, and potentially sell the mineral rights to mining interests from back east. None of these plans took into account the long-term value of the property or the wishes of its legal owner, me, but Papa had never considered my opinions relevant to decisions about my own inheritance. 2 weeks before my scheduled wedding, I received what I'd been waiting for, a letter bearing the seal of the Territorial Marshal's office. Inside was a formal notice that my complaint had been received and assigned to Deputy Territorial Marshal James Crawford for investigation. Marshal Crawford would be arriving in Wigby within the week to conduct interviews and examine evidence related to my allegations against Sheriff Virgil Harrington. More importantly, the letter included a temporary protective order that prohibited anyone from coercing me into marriage without my free and explicit consent. The order carried the full authority of the territorial government and could be enforced by any federal marshal or territorial official. Violation of the order would result in immediate arrest and federal prosecution. I read the letter 3 times to make sure I understood every word, then carefully hid it with my other documents beneath the loose floorboard. The wheels of justice were finally turning, and Papa's carefully constructed world of intimidation and corruption was about to encounter something he'd never faced before, legal authority that operated beyond his control or influence. That evening, I began my final preparations. I packed a small bag with essential clothing and personal items, hiding it in the root cellar, where Papa never ventured. I wrote letters to Mrs. Miller and 2 other women in town who'd shown me kindness over the years, explaining my situation and asking them to serve as character witnesses if needed. Most importantly, I prepared a detailed timeline of Papa's corrupt activities, cross-referenced with the evidence I'd copied from his files. The irony wasn't lost on me that Papa himself had taught me the importance of thorough preparation and attention to detail. He'd always insisted that successful intimidation required careful planning, knowledge of your opponent's weaknesses, and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. He'd just never imagined that someday I'd be applying those lessons against him. Marshal Crawford arrived on a Tuesday morning, riding into town on a sturdy bay horse and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. He was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 35, with steady gray eyes and the kind of careful politeness that suggested he'd learned to navigate complex social situations without unnecessarily escalating tensions. I watched from Miller's store window as he dismounted in front of the courthouse and secured his horse to the hitching post. Papa emerged from his office almost immediately, his body language radiating the territorial aggression he displayed whenever his authority was questioned by outsiders. The 2 men spoke briefly on the courthouse steps, their conversation too distant for me to overhear, but their postures telling a clear story. Papa gestured expansively, playing the role of the harried local official dealing with frivolous complaints from troublemakers. Marshal Crawford listened without visible reaction, occasionally nodding or asking brief questions that caused Papa's gestures to become more emphatic. After perhaps 10 minutes, Marshal Crawford followed Papa into the courthouse, presumably to examine official records and conduct formal interviews. I purchased thread I didn't need from Mrs. Miller and walked home slowly, giving them time to begin their business before the marshal requested to speak with me. The summons came that afternoon, delivered by Deputy Walsh, who looked uncomfortable with his assignment. "Marshal wants to see you at the courthouse," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Says it's about some complaint you filed." I expressed appropriate surprise and concern, as if I couldn't imagine what sort of complaint anyone might have filed on my behalf. Deputy Walsh accepted my performance without question, probably relieved not to be asked to explain the details of what was obviously a delicate situation. Marshal Crawford had set up a temporary office in the courthouse's back room, away from Papa's desk and the normal flow of official business. When I arrived, he stood politely and offered me a chair across from his makeshift desk, which was covered with papers, official forms, and what I recognized as copies of documents from Papa's locked drawer. "Miss Harrington," he said, his voice carrying the neutral courtesy of a man trained to deal with sensitive legal matters. "Thank you for coming. I understand you've filed a complaint with territorial authorities regarding your father's conduct as sheriff and your upcoming marriage to Mr. Jeremiah Barfield." I nodded, keeping my expression appropriately nervous while my mind catalogued everything visible on his desk. "Yes, sir. I wasn't sure what else to do. Can you tell me, in your own words, about the circumstances that led you to contact territorial authorities?" For the next hour, I provided a detailed account of Papa's announcement of my engagement, Jeremiah's character and reputation, and my concerns about being forced into a marriage against my will. Marshal Crawford listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but never showing surprise or judgment about what I revealed. When I finished my account of the personal situation, he shifted to questions about Papa's official conduct. Here, I was more careful, presenting myself as someone who'd gradually become aware of irregularities rather than someone who'd deliberately gathered evidence of criminal activity. "You mentioned in your written complaint that you've observed questionable financial transactions," he said, consulting a copy of my letter. "Can you be more specific about what you've seen?" I described the payments I'd witnessed, the conversations I'd overheard, and the general atmosphere of fear that Papa maintained through selective enforcement of territorial laws. I was careful to present everything as observations made during the course of normal household duties rather than deliberate investigation, portraying myself as an increasingly concerned daughter rather than a calculating prosecutor. Marshal Crawford asked detailed questions about specific incidents, dates, and amounts, cross-referencing my answers with documents he'd already examined. His questions revealed that he'd been thorough in his preliminary investigation, interviewing other townspeople and examining official records with the expertise of someone who'd uncovered corruption before. "Miss Harrington," he said finally, "I want you to understand that filing false charges against a territorial official is itself a serious crime. Are you certain that everything you've told me today is true to the best of your knowledge?" "Yes, sir," I replied without hesitation. I wouldn't have contacted territorial authorities if I wasn't certain something was seriously wrong. He studied me for a long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that he saw more than I'd intended to reveal. But when he spoke again, his tone remained professionally neutral. "Based on my investigation so far, I'll be recommending that territorial authorities take immediate action regarding both your personal situation and the allegations against your father. You should know that this process may take some time and could result in significant changes to your family's circumstances." I expressed appropriate concern about the potential consequences while privately celebrating the news that my plan was working exactly as I'd hoped. Papa's world of intimidation and corruption was about to collapse, and his assumptions about my helplessness would prove to be the foundation of his downfall. That evening, Papa returned home in a foul mood, slamming doors and cursing territorial bureaucrats who didn't understand frontier realities. He'd spent the day being questioned about his financial records, his enforcement practices, and his relationship with various businessmen who'd benefited from his protection. "Damn fool Marshall thinks he can come into my territory and question how I do my job," he fumed, pouring himself a larger than usual measure of whiskey. "Probably some political appointment who's never dealt with real criminals or actual frontier conditions." I served his dinner and listened to him rage about ungrateful citizens who didn't appreciate his efforts to maintain law and order. According to Papa, the territorial government was interfering with local affairs they didn't understand, encouraging troublemakers to challenge legitimate authority with frivolous complaints. "Probably that Jameson woman stirring up trouble," he said, referring to a widow who'd complained about his investigation of her late husband's property records. Or maybe the Miller family, thinking they can avoid paying their fair share for protection. He never suspected that the complaint had come from his own daughter, sitting quietly across from him and nodding sympathetically while planning the final stages of his destruction. Papa's inability to see me as anything more than an extension of his will had blinded him to the most dangerous threat he'd ever faced. The end came faster than I'd expected, though I should have known that 15 years of corruption would leave a trail too obvious for a competent investigator to miss. Marshall Crawford worked methodically through Papa's records, interviewing townspeople who'd been too frightened to speak openly before but who were willing to provide sworn testimony when guaranteed protection from retaliation. Mrs. Miller proved particularly helpful, providing detailed accounts of the protection payments Papa had demanded from local businesses and the threats he'd made against those who couldn't afford his fees. The Jameson widow produced copies of documents showing how Papa had manipulated property transfers after her husband's death, forcing her to sell prime grazing land at a fraction of its value to one of his associates. Most damaging of all, Marshall Crawford located Papa's private ledger, the one he'd thought was safely hidden in his desk drawer. The ledger contained detailed records of every bribe, every protection payment, and every illegal transaction Papa had orchestrated over the past 5 years. Written in his own hand, it provided irrefutable evidence of systematic corruption that violated multiple territorial and federal laws. The arrest came on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week before my scheduled wedding to Jeremiah Barfield. I was hanging laundry behind our house when I heard the commotion from the courthouse, shouting voices, the sound of a struggle, and Papa's voice rising above the rest in a string of curses that could be heard clear across town. By the time I reached Main Street, Papa was already in handcuffs, standing between Marshall Crawford and a deputy territorial marshal who'd arrived during the night. A crowd had gathered despite the early hour, townspeople emerging from shops and houses to witness the unprecedented sight of Sheriff Virgil Harrington being arrested by federal authorities. Papa saw me in the crowd, and his expression shifted from outrage to something approaching desperation. "Margaret Rose," he called out, his voice carrying the commanding tone he'd always used to control my behavior. "You get yourself home and start packing. We'll sort this nonsense out, but you got a wedding to prepare for." I met his eyes steadily, letting him see something I'd kept hidden for years, not defiance exactly, but a complete absence of the fear and submission he'd counted on to keep me in line. For the first time in my life, I looked at my father and felt nothing but pity for a man whose own arrogance had destroyed everything he'd worked to build. "No, Papa," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the crowd. "I don't think I do." The confusion on his face was almost comic. He genuinely couldn't understand why I wasn't rushing to obey his orders or how I could speak to him with such calm certainty. Papa had spent so many years treating me like property that he'd forgotten I was a person capable of independent thought and action. Marshall Crawford led Papa away while the crowd dispersed, people returning to their daily routines with the satisfaction of witnessing justice finally served on a man who'd terrorized their community for years. I walked home slowly, feeling strangely empty after months of careful planning and constant tension. The revenge I'd worked so hard to achieve felt less satisfying than I'd expected, more like the completion of an unpleasant but necessary task than a moment of triumph. Jeremiah Barfield arrived at our house that afternoon, his face flushed with anger and his usual calculating composure replaced by barely controlled panic. He'd obviously heard about Papa's arrest and understood that his own carefully protected position was now in jeopardy. Without Papa's protection, Jeremiah's various illegal enterprises would be exposed to legitimate law enforcement, and his plans for acquiring my property through marriage were now impossible to execute. "What did you tell them?" he demanded, not bothering with his usual pretense of politeness. "What lies have you been spreading about honest businessmen trying to make a living in this territory?" I continued kneading bread dough, my hands working the mixture with steady rhythm while I considered how much to reveal. I told them the truth about Papa's business arrangements. about the protection payments and the property transfers, and the way certain men got special treatment in exchange for regular contributions to Papa's private income. Jeremiah's face went pale as he realized the implications of what I'd just said. If territorial authorities were investigating Papa's corrupt practices, they'd inevitably discover Jeremiah's role as one of his primary partners in crime. The payments, the fraudulent property deals, the intimidation of honest citizens, all of it would come to light during a thorough investigation. "You little fool," he snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Your father was keeping order in this territory, protecting decent people from chaos and lawlessness. Without his guidance, this place will fall apart within a year." I shaped the dough into loaves and placed them in greased pans, my movements precise and unhurried despite Jeremiah's increasingly agitated pacing. Papa was running a criminal enterprise under cover of his badge. The only people he protected were those who paid him to ignore their crimes. Everyone else lived in fear of his retaliation. "And what about our arrangement?" Jeremiah demanded. "What about the agreements your father and I made regarding your future and your property?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the confrontation I'd planned and rehearsed during countless sleepless nights. I wiped my hands on my apron and turned to face him directly, letting him see the same calm certainty I'd shown Papa during his arrest. "There is no arrangement," I said clearly. "I never consented to marry you, and I never will. Any agreements Papa made were illegal under territorial law, since he had no authority to dispose of my person or my property without my consent." Jeremiah stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. Like Papa, he'd clearly never considered that I might understand legal concepts or possess the intelligence to research my own rights under territorial statutes. "Your father promised you to me," he said, his voice taking on the threatening tone I'd heard him use with his workers and servants. "We have witnesses to his commitment, and I've already made significant investments based on our understanding." "What you have," I replied, placing the bread pans in the oven with deliberate care, "is a verbal agreement with a man who's just been arrested for corruption and abuse of authority. Any promises Papa made about forcing me into marriage are now void, since he no longer has the power to carry them out." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of firewood in the stove and the distant sounds of normal life continuing outside our kitchen. Jeremiah stood perfectly still for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists and his breathing shallow with suppressed rage. "You think you're very clever," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "But you're still just a woman alone in a territory where women need protection. Without your father's authority backing you, you'll find life considerably more difficult than you imagine." I met his threatening stare without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage I hadn't known I possessed until I'd been forced to discover them. "Mr. Barfield, I'm under the protection of territorial authorities now. Any attempt to coerce, threaten, or harm you will result in federal charges and immediate intervention by territorial marshals. I suggest you focus on preparing your own defense rather than making threats you can't carry out." For a moment, I thought he might actually strike me, his face contorted with the fury of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and violence. But even Jeremiah wasn't foolish enough to assault a woman under federal protection while territorial marshals were actively investigating his business practices. He turned and stormed out of the house without another word, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I watched through the kitchen window as he mounted his horse and rode away, probably heading straight to his lawyer's office to begin damage control efforts that would prove largely futile once investigators began examining his financial records. That evening, Marshal Crawford stopped by to inform me that Papa would be transported to Denver for trial on federal corruption charges. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and territorial authorities expected him to be convicted and sentenced to several years in federal prison. His assets would be seized to pay restitution to his victims, though I would retain ownership of Mama's property since it had never legally belonged to Papa. "What about Jeremiah Barfield?" I asked, serving the marshal coffee and fresh bread that filled the kitchen with warmth and the illusion of normal domestic life. "We're building a case against him as well," Marshal Crawford replied. Your father's ledger contains detailed records of Mr. Barfield's payments and the services he received in return. Conspiracy charges, at minimum, possibly more depending on what else we uncover." He paused to butter a slice of bread, his expression thoughtful. "I have to say, Miss Harrington, your complaint was remarkably well documented for someone without legal training. You included exactly the right information presented in exactly the right format to support a thorough investigation." I kept my expression carefully neutral while my heart hammered against my ribs. "I just tried to be thorough, sir. Papa always said attention to detail was important in any serious endeavor." Marshall Crawford's smile suggested he suspected there was more to my story than I was revealing, but he didn't press for additional details. "Well, your thoroughness has helped ensure that justice will be served. The territorial government takes a very dim view of corrupt officials who abuse their authority, particularly when it involves violating citizens' basic rights." After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen that had been the center of my planning and preparation for so many weeks. The house felt different now, larger somehow, as if Papa's dominating presence had been shrinking the rooms around me for years. I could hear normal evening sounds from the street, children playing, neighbors calling to each other, the ordinary bustle of a community going about its business, without fear of arbitrary punishment or sudden retaliation. The next few weeks passed in a strange combination of relief and adjustment as I learned to live without the constant weight of Papa's expectations and threats. Mrs. Miller offered me work in her store, which would provide income while I decided what to do with Mama's property and my newfound independence. Other townspeople, no longer afraid of Papa's retaliation, began treating me with genuine kindness rather than the careful neutrality they'd maintained while he was in power. Jeremiah Barfield left town suddenly in the middle of October, reportedly heading for California just ahead of federal marshals who'd arrived with warrants for his arrest. His abandoned property was seized by territorial authorities, and his various business enterprises collapsed without Papa's protection to shield them from legitimate law enforcement. The circuit judge who'd agreed to perform my wedding ceremony sent his regrets, claiming scheduling conflicts that everyone understood were actually prudent distance from a legal arrangement that had become politically toxic. Without Papa's influence to force the issue, and with Jeremiah fleeing prosecution, my marriage plans simply evaporated like morning mist in sunlight. November brought the first real snow and news that Papa had been convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to 8 years in territorial prison. The trial had been brief and decisive, with Papa's own records providing most of the evidence needed for conviction. He'd apparently continued to maintain his innocence even in the face of overwhelming proof, insisting that he'd been a victim of political persecution by territorial authorities who didn't understand frontier realities. I felt surprisingly little satisfaction when I heard about his conviction, though I did experience a profound sense of relief that the threat he'd represented was finally and permanently removed. Papa had spent so many years using fear and intimidation to control others that he'd forgotten those tools could be turned against him by someone patient enough to learn how the system actually worked. Winter settled over Wigby with unusual gentleness, as if the town itself was recovering from years of tension and uncertainty. I spent my days working in Miller's store, learning about commerce, and developing relationships with traveling merchants who brought news from other territories and distant cities. Mrs. Miller proved to be an excellent teacher, sharing knowledge about business practices, customer relations, and the delicate art of maintaining neutrality in small-town politics. In the evenings, I worked on improving Mama's property, using income from the store and back rent that Papa's business associates were now required to pay directly to me. The land was more valuable than Papa had ever admitted, with good water rights, fertile soil, and timber stands that could provide sustainable income if managed properly. Spring brought news that Jeremiah Barfield had been captured in California and was being transported back to face federal charges related to his conspiracy with Papa. He'd apparently attempted to establish similar corrupt arrangements with officials in Sacramento, only to discover that California law enforcement was considerably less tolerant of territorial corruption than Papa had been. I felt no particular satisfaction about Jeremiah's capture either, though I was relieved to know he'd never be able to return to threaten me or other vulnerable women. Like Papa, He built his life around exploiting others through fear and intimidation, never considering that his victims might eventually find ways to fight back effectively. By summer, Wigby had settled into a new rhythm under legitimate law enforcement provided by territorial authorities. Deputy Walsh had been appointed interim sheriff after investigators determined he'd been following Papa's orders under duress rather than participating willingly in corruption. The town felt lighter somehow, more prosperous, as honest businesses flourished without having to pay protection money and law-abiding citizens could pursue their livelihoods without fear of arbitrary persecution. I celebrated my 20th birthday in July with a small party at Mrs. Miller's house, surrounded by women who'd become genuine friends rather than careful acquaintances afraid to show too much kindness to the sheriff's daughter. We shared cake and conversation about everything from business opportunities to book recommendations, the sort of normal social interaction I'd never experienced while living under Papa's authoritarian control. That evening, sitting on Mrs. Miller's porch and watching the sun set behind the mountains, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me from desperate fear to genuine independence in less than a year. Papa had always insisted that women were naturally helpless creatures who needed male protection and guidance to survive in a harsh world. He'd used that assumption to justify his control over my life, never suspecting that his own treatment had taught me exactly how to research legal options, gather evidence, and present a case to authorities who operated beyond his influence. The irony wasn't lost on me that Papa's corruption had provided most of the evidence needed to destroy him. His meticulous record-keeping, designed to ensure he could collect on debts and maintain control over his criminal enterprises, had made it easy for investigators to trace every illegal transaction and document every abuse of authority. His assumption that I was too simple to understand what I was seeing had allowed me to copy those records and present them to territorial authorities in a format that ensured swift and decisive action. Most of all, Papa's failure to see me as a complete person rather than an extension of his will had blinded him to the most effective threat he'd ever faced. He taught me to be thorough, patient, and strategic in pursuing long-term goals, then assumed I'd never be intelligent or motivated enough to apply those lessons against him. As autumn returned to Wigby, bringing golden aspens and the promise of another winter, I found myself looking forward to the future with genuine excitement rather than dread. Mama's property was thriving under my management. Mrs. Miller had made me a full partner in the store, and I'd received several letters from eligible young men in neighboring territories who'd heard about the educated woman running a successful business in Wigby. I wasn't in any hurry to marry, having learned that independence was considerably more satisfying than I'd been led to believe during my years under Papa's control. But the knowledge that I could choose my own future, marry whom I pleased when I pleased, and build whatever sort of life I wanted was worth more than all the security Papa's arrangements could have provided. Sometimes, late at night, when snow muffled the sounds of the sleeping town, I thought about Papa sitting in his prison cell and wondered if he'd ever understood what had really happened to him. Probably not. Men like Papa and Jeremiah were too invested in their assumptions about women's helplessness to recognize when those assumptions had been turned against them. They'd built their lives around underestimating others, never considering that underestimation was a weakness that could be exploited by someone patient and clever enough to see the opportunities it created. I'd learned that the most devastating revenge wasn't violence or dramatic confrontation, but simply the patient application of truth and law to men who'd assumed they were above both. Papa had destroyed himself through his own corruption. I'd simply provided territorial authorities with the evidence they needed to see what had been hidden in plain sight for years. The genius of my revenge lay not in any elaborate scheme or clever manipulation, but in my willingness to trust that legitimate authority would respond appropriately to properly presented evidence of criminal behavior. Papa had spent so many years corrupting the system that he'd forgotten there were still honest officials who took territorial law seriously and had the power to enforce it. In the end, Papa's downfall had been almost anticlimactic. A few letters, some copied documents, and the patient testimony of citizens who'd been waiting years for someone brave enough to speak truth to corrupt authority. No violence, no dramatic confrontations, no complex schemes requiring perfect timing or extraordinary luck. Just truth, properly documented and presented to people with the authority and integrity to act on it. As I drifted off to sleep in my warm bed in my own house on my own property, I smiled to think how Papa would react if he knew the full scope of what his helpless daughter had accomplished. But Papa would probably never understand that his greatest mistake hadn't been teaching me to be thorough or strategic or patient in pursuing long-term goals. His greatest mistake had been assuming that a woman who possessed those qualities would never have the intelligence, courage, or motivation to use them against him. He'd been wrong about that, just as he'd been wrong about nearly everything else that mattered. And his wrongness had given me exactly the tools I needed to build a life he'd never imagined I was capable of creating for myself.